Here I'm going to walk you through at a very high level the dairy supply chain. Dairy has become a very important global commodity. We're using all kinds of dairy milk powder, if you will, in different types of formulations. People may be drinking less fluid milk in the United States, but they're consuming more cheese, more products with milk powder and so forth in it. And so we're also trading a lot of milk powder now overseas, and we're going to talk more about these. So if you think about, again, we're going to look at going back to our standard model for this course. Let's think about a supply chain for dairy. We're going to look at the growing contractual arrangements going on and how these governance systems operated by firms like Nestle, General Mills, and others, what they're doing with regard to dairy. In a very broad sense, if you think about dairy production all the way from the consumer, all the way back through to production, here's a very classic way of looking at the dairy supply chain. We produce feed and other inputs for the animal. It produces milk. That milk is transported to a processing plant where it's processed, packaged, distributed, put in different types of retail outlets, and finally on to consumers. Here's another way of looking at the dairy supply chain. This is something I developed for my farm management class. But if you think about the same type concepts are in there, I just put a little more detail into how we think about milk. So we think about the United States, we're producing all types of feed inputs. We house these cows, we milk them on dairy farms. We transport them typically less than 200 miles in insulated tanker trucks. We've got more than 1,000 processing plants that make these in all kinds of different products. We tend to package all those in different ways. We distribute those in different types of food service, retailers, and other firms. They in turn sell these on to other types of companies. And finally, a consumer, why do they buy milk products? Well, they're buying dairy products because they've got essential nutrients that we need as part of our body. Here are uses of fluid milk. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but look at all the different types of things that we use fluid milk for, other than liquid milk going to consumers. Several years ago, I used this example in a case study that I did for one of my other classes. If you think about, in its very basic terms, milk can be thought of as being on a pyramid. In general, liquid milk and commodity cheeses require much less capital expenditures, so it takes much less capital to convert that liquid milk into that fluid milk coming from a cow into liquid milk for consumption or in commodity type cheeses. And yet consumers consume a lot of these different products. These are what we call low margin type goods. At the very top are what we think of as dried dairy ingredients. So think about the fact that Irish Bailey's cream, for example, has got dairy milk in it. That milk is only a small part of what's actually in the whiskey and other things that are in Bailey's Irish cream. That pharmaceutical grade milk requires a lot of different types of capital expenditures to make that type of product. And so the amount of milk is very small, but there's a high margin and less market volume being used though. The same thing is true for infant formula and other things like that. They have higher margins, but higher capital expenditures to hit those margins. What are some dominant economic traits if we think about ways to look at the dairy industry? One way to think about this is market size. We think about data, for example, on consumption and supply. Many farmers have got more than one choice of a person to buy their milk from. Different types of products have all got different market growth rates, but in general, what we see for dairy is we've got all very positive growth rates all around the world. We see more and more contracting going on as these chain captains, like Danone, for example, setting up non-GMO organic milk and yogurt. They want to have direct relationships with large farmers. It's getting somewhat hard to exit dairying because we've seen an increase in technology costs, and we're seeing all kinds of technology being changed. Robots, breeding, dairy margin insurance in the 2018 Farm Bill in the United States. We're seeing growing differentiation. We're seeing different types of scope and size in terms of herds and what the types of breeds being used. Milk plants are all full in general in terms of being fully utilized. We do see average cost curves differing by size of production. We'll see some of those. More capital requirements going on. Again, we've got some industry profitability as long as corn is cheap and milk prices are above the long-term average, but as we're going to see, that's generally not the case right now. What we're seeing is we're getting more and more milk per cow. So the farm I worked at as a child had much less milk coming out of each of those cows than a modern dairy farm today in Minnesota. And here's another way of looking at that. In 1954, we were getting 2 gallons of milk equivalent. In 2013, we're getting almost 8 gallons of milk. Large dairy herds have more economies of scale and size. Here's some data put together by my colleague, Dr. Maren Bozic. And what it's showing there is that basically we're seeing more lower costs, if you will, by larger dairy operations. Here's some data that Maren has put together by Minnesota numbers by herd size, and you can look at that there. We're seeing larger and larger herds growing in many parts of Minnesota. In general, we're seeing the herd size doubles every 10 years or so, and we're seeing exits approaching 50%. So there's a high rate of exit in dairy production, but we're seeing the herd size getting bigger and bigger in size over the last 50 or 60 years. We're seeing milk production moving around. So the green part is where we've seen growth in terms of milk supply in southwest Idaho, parts of the Central Valley in California, the Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico, parts of western Minnesota, parts of eastern Wisconsin and western Michigan, parts of upstate New York. Demand for milk fat is increasing as people want more and more protein. So as people want more protein in things like yogurt and different types of milk products like Fairlife, we're seeing more and more demand for this protein, which is in this milk fat. However, milk consumption is going down, but as I said before, people are actually consuming more dairy products. So the dairy demand curve is shifting outward, even though one type of product, in terms of fluid milk consumption in the United States, is going downward. Cheese consumption is going upward, no small surprise as we think about the different products that require cheese. We've seen a big increase in the exports of dairy products. This died off a little bit with some of the tariff issues in the summer of 2018. But our exchange rates relative to other countries are competitive enough that we're able to export 10 to 15% of our milk powder, which was something we were not doing in large amounts prior to 2004. Globally, where do we see dairy production? The United States. Argentina is growing its herd size, Uruguay and Chile, New Zealand, especially on the North Island, parts of Australia, parts of Europe, the green belt, if you will, in terms of Northern Ireland and Western Ireland, northern part of Scotland, the Netherlands, Denmark, northern part of Germany, Western Lithuania, and Poland. All of those are areas where we're seeing dairy production increasing around the world. So as we think about the dairy production part of the chain now, there's a lot of things going on in terms of how the supply of milk is growing globally in response to demand by consumers for these high protein products.